Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln. Tonight's episode, Make the Noise. Earlier on Project Binky. At the end of the previous episode, we'd got as far as putting the engine in, but we left you on a bit of a cliffhanger, which I should probably apologise for. Last time we very carefully didn't promise anything, but in this episode I can guarantee 100% there's a 50-50 chance of hearing this thing run, and probably only a 10% chance of that. There are a few jobs that need doing before we can attempt to start this engine for the first time, so we'll pick straight up where we left off. Now that the engine is in, we can bolt up the torque reaction brace and the two little bushes. Start the engine without this in place, and the motor will rock backwards and forwards on the two upper engine mounts, and we just can't have that. It also gives Nick a chance to show off his nuts. He took an inordinately long time scrubbing, cleaning and plating them, so it's only natural for him to want to show them off. You might remember the original member being a colossal pressed metal thing that weighed a metric ton. Our considerably more svelte tubular steel version does exactly the same thing with a fraction of the mass. The bushes are bolted to the brace after being attached to the engine and gearbox, and now the whole thing is screwed onto the chassis. That'll stop the engine moving around and potentially bashing into things. Excellent, the motor is fixed so we're closer to firing it up. But before we do, we need to put the shafts in? Not quite what I was expecting, but Nick's a complicated person, so it's not a surprise. Fitting the drive shafts takes guile and cunning and a deft touch. Yeah, like that. Next up, it's the front strut and top mount assembly. We're using new OEM style rubber top mounts for a modicum of comfort, but had to modify them to add longer studs to take into account the extra thickness of the strut tower and the inclusion of a strut brace. Bolted to the strut is the upright. These of course aren't new, they just had the bearings replaced and the whole thing powder coated. Oh, and the dry flange modified to go to a 4x108 stud pattern. Can't remember whether that's a new nut or one Nick's plated. No, it's a new one, otherwise it'd be gold. Next up for the treatment is the bottom arm. This has been given a brand new ball joint and new polyurethane bushings. You might be aghast at the lack of power tools being deployed here, but fear not, there'll be plenty of opportunity for that later. That's one corner done, and the other one is just waiting for me to say the magic words, get the kettle on, and this corner is done too. The front suspension isn't complete without the new transverse brace, which sort of ties the whole thing together. Again, remade in a tubular stylee for fewer grams and for more dimpled dyed speed holes, the brace contains an instruction in the case of an emergency. These bolts are just nipped up for now, and that's the front suspension on.
Hopefully you've noticed that these are not these, because these are completely shagged. Now we could have rebuilt them, but even if these were perfect, they probably weren't totally suitable for this car, so we could use some adjustability. And at that point, it's actually easier to start from scratch. Or at least, it's more cost effective to send them to somebody else to start from scratch.
Quite a few moons hence, we sent off the scabby old dampers to Leader Suspension in Lincolnshire, who told us they could definitely come up with something more suitable for the Mini. After supplying them with the patterns along with some basic information like approximate weight, wheelbase, track width, tyre size, etc., drawings were batted backwards and forwards until we were happy to sign them off and get them made. The brackets needed were laser cut. Nick didn't have a hand in any of this. And then the bodies were machined up and then they could be assembled. We had them shortened by 25mm, which fixes our little bump steer issue at full droop. Before going any further, they get primed, and then each of the dampers gets a session on the dyno to make sure that it's operating within the design parameters. Once they've been fettled, they get a lick of blue paint to finish them off before being assembled with their springs and top mounts. Coilovers don't have to be crashy and uncomfortable. Get the right damping and spring rate and they're fine. And anyway, if these need fine tuning,
don't do it.
The massive knob can adjust them.
I mean, it works, it's just not very elegant, is it?
Uh-oh, I know that look. It was always our intention to come up with a better way of attaching the track rod to the strut. Those of you who are worried about the arm being welded to the damper, well, it's not unusual at all. Many manufacturers use this type of design. Our dampers are fully rebuildable if they wear out, and if we bend one, Leader can whip us up a replacement. The new bracket has counterboard holes for the cap head screws to sit in, and this clip is sped up to represent the speed we wish the mill could work. The square ends then have a nice radius machined onto them. Smooth. The final machining op is to put a taper into the hole where the track rod end is inserted. Setup and centering the bracket on the faceplate took a little time, and one tiny move here and the piece is ruined. Thankfully, on the third attempt, Nick got it spot on. A jest, of course. It was 5. Time to check that fit. Disco. Do that all again and you get 2. Now to get on and fit them. First things first, a little copper grease on the steering arms. That makes subsequent alignment adjustments a whole hell of a lot easier. The new brackets have had a coat of black epoxy paint, and the brand new cap heads have, of course, been treated to a strip, plate and green coating, because lunatic. We tap the 2 holes in the strut arm to M10 by 1.5, and they should be plenty beefy enough. We spent quite a long time researching track rod ends. We needed one with the correct internal thread, a suitable length, preferably one with a slight jog on the end. We looked through hundreds of pictures on the internet, and that was before we started our research. Well, that solution to the steering attachment is neat, elegant, and it looks like it works perfectly.
Yes it does. But the yang to that is that these track rod ends are off an Alfa Romeo, and while they work perfectly for the steering, at some point, despite Richard's best efforts, we're going to be chasing some sort of random intermittent electrical issue. But we've got to get there first.
With the front suspension sorted, we may as well crack on with the rest of the running gear. So, while Nick gets on with that, I'm going to get the funk out. prop shaft marks the end of the major running gear fitting, and I can assure you that this is every bit as uncomfortable as it looks. Still, it does show off Nick's fantastic flange fingering technique. One of the show spanners is then deployed to make sure it's done up to the required torque. FT, Natch. It might seem odd to fit all this stuff before starting the engine, but the gearbox is completely dry after a rebuild, and if the engine runs, the gearbox will rotate, and therefore it needs oil in it. Without the shafts and the prop, the oil just runs out all over the floor, so that all had to go on before filling the gearbox. So the prop is in and the underside is looking resplendent, but we can't go pouring lube into the transmission just yet, because there's still 2 holes that need some attention. These ports are to feed a transmission cooler.
Only we're not running one, and we can't just bung them up because one of those ports comes directly from the internal gearbox oil pump, so they need looping together. Only we haven't got enough room to do that, conventionally.
Not that many cars came with a transmission oil cooler as standard, but the Celica GT4 was one of them. You see, in rallying, particularly Group N rallying back in the day, which was for only very lightly modified showroom spec cars, if the model you could buy off the forecourt didn't have, say a transmission oil cooler, as standard, you weren't allowed to fit one. So the manufacturers in those days fitted all sorts of cool bits to their rally homologated cars, so they had a chance of finishing events like the Safari, for example. Now, our little Mini isn't a competition car. It's not going to be subjected to the sustained abuse you expect in rallying, nor is it going to weigh as much as a Group N Celica, so we don't think we'll be losing any reliability from the missing cooler. Now, it would have been a shed load easier just to bung up the holes, but had we done that, no oil would have been circulating inside the gearbox, and we'd have had a catastrophic transmission failure in pretty short order. After carefully parting off the threaded collar on the bandsaw, Nick coats it in some black epoxy paint for that stealthy look. The original fittings are then removed and replaced by some Dash 8 port adapters. Now you'll be able to see what we had in mind when we designed this bypass assembly.
Here's one for you. American made Dash 8 AN fitting for a 1/2 inch hardline. M18 by 1.5 thread.
All that's left now is to see if it fits. And of course it does. If the length of the threaded collar hadn't been spot on, the 2 fittings screwed into it would have been offset and wouldn't have fitted onto the port adapters. I reckon that's another elegant but robust solution. And now we really can put some gearbox oil into it. Exciting! And it's pouring out of the level hole, so I guess that means it's full.
Ooh.
After bunging it up, we put the kettle on and had a brew and a biscuit. Or 2. Or 3. I went back to see if there was any oil on the floor. And there wasn't. And now we really can begin to fit all the little but vital parts needed to get this engine running. Connecting the battery up and fitting the bracket over the top is quite the milestone. And now we can really get down to the nitty-gritty. Now, I'm not saying we've been longing this job out, but while we've been tinkering away in the shed, Link Engine Management have developed an entirely new architecture. So they sent us an updated version of the Fury ECU called the Fury X. Luckily for me, it's a straight swap, so changing it couldn't have been simpler. Right, we haven't powered this up for a long time, so fire extinguisher at the ready, mother on speed dial, let's do this.
We're on fire!
Which is a definite plus. Before we go any further, I need to connect the ECU to my laptop and then do some fiddling around for a bit. So I've done the basic configuration and now it's time to calibrate some of the parts that we're using. And we're going to start with the throttle pedal, which you've not seen yet. After much research, we ended up with this 2008 Subaru Legacy pedal because it has a metal bracket and a metal arm that we can modify. A lot of the recent fly-by-wire pedals are entirely plastic and quite bulky, so this one seemed perfect. It's also externally sprung, so if we need to change the feel of the throttle pedal, we can just change the springs. The only thing we struggled for was a new plug to wire it into the ECU. Couldn't find one anywhere, until we realised it wasn't just a throttle pedal potentiometer. It was also used on many throttle bodies, like the one on our Impreza. And it was just a standard Sumitomo housing and pins. Just for now, I've set up a very basic e-throttle table that'll be fine to test it, but it'll need some fine tuning later on. With e-throttle, the throttle body does not have to act in direct proportion to the pedal position. You can have just 50% throttle opening at 100% throttle pedal if you want, or literally any proportion that you wish. This setup is a quick 10% throttle pedal equals 10% throttle opening, and so on. But does it work? Yep. Which is nice. The software allows us to test each individual coil pack and each individual injector before we even try to crank it. That'll show up any potential wiring or hardware issues. So I'm going to switch on coil pack number 1 on its own to see if it's working. And it is. So that's terrific. So what we need to do now is test the other 3 coils and the 4 injectors in the same way to make sure we have no issues.
Yep. Nice.
Okay.
Three.
Sounds good.
Stay. And 4. And the plug's about wanked this one.
Okay, that's all for ignition.
Okay.
So that's
Do
good.
you want to do injector 1?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure, bear with me a sec. Okay, injector test. Injector 1.
Yep. 2.
Hang on. 2.
Nice.
3.
Yep.
3. Okay.
Yep.
And
4.
4.
Nice.
Okay. That's good.
That's excellent.
Now that we know the injectors and coils are working, the next job is to crank it over and make sure there's oil pressure. We're just topping off the oil level before we attempt that. Let's give it a go. Bugger. Turns out the MG immobiliser system needs a feedback from the door catch to confirm the driver's door is open before it'll let the engine crank. So, We've jury-rigged the original MG catch assembly and wired it into our door loom to fool the bloody black box. And we've wired in an LED because that's part of the system. So let's try that again. Yes! You can see the round dial showing good pressure even at cranking speed.
I'll take that.
We also wanted to check to make sure the oil is getting to the turbo. Loads of it. A demonstration of why the flow restrictor is so important. Next job is to set the static timing, and for that we need the venerable old timing light. This procedure tells the ECU where in the 4-stroke cycle the crank is. Once it's set and correct, the ECU can then vary the timing, advancing or retarding the moment the spark plug is fired. This is a critical process for the correct running of the engine. There's a toothed wheel on the crank pulley. The teeth pass a sensor, and there's one tooth missing. When the sensor sees that gap from the missing tooth, that's called the trigger. What we're doing here is setting the trigger offset. So that's how far away from top dead center the trigger is. Once the ECU knows that, the rest is gravy. It took a few goes, but what we want to see is the bright strobe mark lining up with the leftmost timing mark on the engine cover. Excellent. The static timing is now set to 10 degrees before top dead center. The coils and the injectors work, the e-throttle setup works, we've got oil pressure, so now the spark plugs can go in. Once the plugs are secure, the coil packs get installed and tightened down, and for now, there's nothing left to put on the engine. The next step is to put some of Tesco's finest in it.
Woohoo! Getting exciting now.
The petrol is in, so we can now test the fuel system properly for the first time.
Yeah, buzz it. Whoa! Shut it off, shut it off. Bollocks.
What?
Bloody big leak.
Where?
Right, sort it, tiny.
Okay.
Happy enough that there's no seepage, we can now set the base fuel pressure, and we're going for 3.5 bar. The fuel pressure is set using the screw on top of the regulator. Just wind this in until you've got the pressure you're looking for, and then tighten the lock nut.
3.2, 3.3, 3.4.
Yes, the fuel pump is incredibly noisy. Yes, we're aware that it shouldn't be. Yes, we probably damaged it in the years it's been kicking around the workshop, and yes, there's a replacement on the way. But it works, and there's now nothing stopping us from attempting the first start. Here we go. If it was going to go, it would have gone by now. And because it isn't, there's no point in flattening the battery, so we may as well investigate what's going wrong. In a 4-stroke engine, each cycle has 720 degrees of crank rotation. That means there are 2 instances of the piston being at top dead centre. When we set the trigger offset earlier, we didn't know whether the top dead centre was on the compression or the exhaust stroke. There's no way of telling. And it turned out we had the ignition firing exactly 360 degrees out. Change the offset to compensate, and we can try again. next time for another exciting episode from the files of Project Binky.
So after a successful first start, the floor appears to be dry. Can't see anything waiting to drip. So it looks like we've got no leaks under here of any sort, although weirdly there is a pomegranate.
As well as a pasty looking cabbage.
F*** off.